Hey, it's Andy here, the Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. I want you to know we're working hard at getting new shows set to go for the rest of the year, and we've got a lot of great guests already lined up, but they're not ready yet. However, the markets have been reacting strongly to several international developments having to do with trade tariffs and trade agreements. So we thought it would be a great idea to go back and replay the interview I did with AEI resident scholar Derek Scissors. His thoughts on how trade negotiations would be balanced between NAFTA and China are worth listening to again to really frame the current negotiations that are going on today. This show was originally broadcast on November 24th, 2017. Please enjoy. Wow, has it been a busy international fall this year with the spotlight mainly on the Far East. Just a few examples, we've had several launches of missiles from North Korea, we had a major internal and political economic meeting in China, and we had a trip to the region by President Trump. Clearly, we have a need for some perspective and forward thinking on this, especially as we begin to think about what will happen in 2018. Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush. Hey, please subscribe to the podcast by going to iTunes and searching for CFTC Talks, or you can listen to the podcast by going on our website, cftc.gov, and click on the podcast button. Just a quick reminder, there's a disclaimer at the end of the show that's important for you to hear. We now turn to someone who has been covering the Far East since the 1990s. Derek Scissors is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI. His focus is on the Chinese and Indian economies and on U.S. relations with Asia. He is concurrently the chief economist of the Chinese Beige Book. Derek, welcome to CFTC Talks.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, recently on the show, we had Citi's global head of commodity research on, Ed Morris, and one of the things he learned very early in his career was that commodity markets, I know this is going to sound shocking, are highly politicized. So I wanted to ask you about early in your career if you had the same experience, because you were the action officer in international economics and energy at the Office of Secretary of Defense in the U.S. Defense Department in 1989 and 90, and I'm just curious what that role was like and what did it teach you about international economic policy?
Well, I think you could fairly say that commodities markets were politicized because the energy market was slightly affected by the invasion of Kuwait and the U.S. ensuing U.S. war with Iraq.
Just a little bit.
Right. So I think, if that's what Ed's thinking about, I'm with him 100%. That job was, the econ side of DOD is always marginal, or not always, but most of the time it's marginal. Everybody was focused on security stuff. I got to contribute to a paper about whether sanctions would be effective against the then Iraqi regime, and we argued no, and I think we were right. So it was a wonderful time. It was very clear that the commodities market was being affected by political decisions, and what you learn then is something that everybody involved in commodities trading and production knows, which is you're always pricing in some element of political risk, and sometimes it's minor, and then you have to be prepared for when it's no longer minor.
Yeah, the X factor, as it were. You put a small number in front of it, and then you put a bigger number as you get closer and closer to a bad event occurring. Well, let's jump into the present now, because there's a lot going on in the space that you cover. So let's start with some of the basics about China and their companies for our audience. And I'm going to ask you a question I think I know what the answer is to already, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Are there companies structured similar to U.S. companies, or do they operate under very different incentives?
Well, there is a Chinese private sector, and let's start with them because they're the closest to U.S. companies. And okay. I would say that 90% of the time, the Chinese private sector acts like an American private company. Right. The problem is, we were just talking about this X factor, the political risk factor. The Chinese private firms are still beholden to the Communist Party. You're not protected by the rule of law. If your existence as a company and possibly your freedom as a person is contingent on whether the party is happy with you. So, you could be dealing with a Chinese private company for several years and they seem just like an American company, and then something happens where the party is demanding that they do something or objecting to something they're doing, and suddenly the situation is very, very different. Now, state-owned enterprises are completely different kettle of fish. We should basically understand those as arms of the Chinese government. That doesn't mean that they're always, looking to perform, acts of perfidy or anything of the sort, but they're political tools. They're tools for employment, they're tools for production, they're tools for lending, they're tools for exporting, and that's how you should understand a state-owned enterprise. It is not a commercial concern. It is not a profit-seeking entity. It is essentially a government arm involved in markets.
And I think, and you and I had a conversation offline, and yet there's people who are surprised when those state-owned enterprises, their stocks actually do pretty good, because for some reason, people don't understand that the stock price and whether or not they're acting as a private sector company it may be two very different things.
Yeah, the Chinese stock market is not, it doesn't match up risk and return. That's not its purpose at all. If you are thinking about, let's take the biggest example, PetroChina, which is the listed subsidiary of CNPC, the largest Chinese oil company. Terrible stock performance for years and years now. Nonetheless, there's no way CNPC ever goes out of business. It's not allowed to. It will never go out of business. And so, you have a very low downside risk. You can be outperformed by the market if you hold a state-owned enterprise, but it's basically like holding, an insured deposit in the United States. You're never going to see that stock die. So there's an appeal there. And then the second part of the appeal is when China says we want to dominate robotics, or we want to dominate biomedicine, or we want to dominate high-speed rail, what they mean is state-owned enterprises are going to have a ton of costless subsidies. They'll never have to repay them, and they may not be they won't effectively use that subsidy. The return on that capital is low, but from your perspective as a stockholder, if the Chinese government wants to subsidize a company heavily, that stock could go up a lot.
So, I mean, wrapping this back to investors and really in U.S. policymakers, how should they view these companies? I mean, are they strategic competitors? Are they just a completely different animal? I mean, I think you laid out a lot of this already, but I just think it's interesting for people to hear that it's a you can't view them through the same prism that you use and look at U.S. companies, and it really entails that U.S. policymakers look at these companies differently as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that both investors and policymakers shouldn't treat them as U.S. companies, but I do think investors and policymakers should see them totally differently, meaning that when China says it's undergoing reform of its state sector, that's what they call it. The reform primarily consists of merging state-owned enterprises so that instead of two or three companies, there's only one, because two or three companies controlled by the state is way too much competition, so we're going to have one company controlled by the state. Those mergers can be stock positive. You're going to have more economies of scale. You may be able to sell because of those economies of scale on foreign markets, to a greater extent than you would. So if you're an investor, you're thinking, okay, well, I don't know if I'd call this reform, but I might want to increase my exposure to China Minmetals after it takes over China Metallurgical. If you're a policymaker, what you're seeing is the Chinese have no interest in allowing market-based competition, and what they're doing is creating larger companies to take over more of the world market share while protecting their home market. Because, again, those companies can't go out of business. So what they want to do is they want to come to the U.S., maybe drive your companies out of business if they can. You cannot drive them out of business. So the investor side is, these mergers, consolidating these companies, there's a share price opportunity here, at least in the short term. The policymaker side is, okay, this is a threat. It's a non-commercial, government-led threat to our economy of some magnitude or another. But both sides should understand these are not regular companies. They're tools of the Chinese state.
Well, and that's a great point. I guess what I'm thinking is that's for the inbound investors into China. Let's talk a little bit about the outbound investment. And really, there's been a lot of press recently about Chinese investments in the United States. And you have something called the China Global Investment Tracker, which is a comprehensive data set covering outbound investment from China, which is really fun to play around. But what is this data showing, and what does it tell you about Chinese investment strategy?
Well, so, I mean, I've been tracking Chinese investment, and thanks for the plug. The data is all public. You can just type China Global Investment Tracker into Google. You can get the Excel file. You can see all of our transactions, and at this point, there are over 2,000 of them. So I've been tracking Chinese investment in 2005. They're not trying to do the same thing all the time. At one point, they were in 2007 when Goldman Sachs was saying oil was going to go up to past $200 a barrel. The Chinese were frantically looking for commodities. Oil, certainly, but also iron ore, also coal. They're still interested in that, but it's not as frantic. Now the main interest is tech and agriculture. And those are more sensitive for many countries, so the Chinese don't necessarily succeed in their purchases. But the big purchase in it closed this year, it started in 2016, was a Swiss biotech company called Syngenta, by far the largest purchase the Chinese have ever made, absolutely entirely funded by the Chinese state, with an SOE as the front company, but the SOE is much smaller than Syngenta. It's Chinese state money. So the headline story is the Chinese are looking to make what they consider strategic purchases. Now, what they consider strategic has changed. Now they're more interested in shipping than they are, in coal, for example. But that's the state side of it. The private side of it is, a lot of times private companies want to diversify or just outright get money out of China. So what we saw in 2016, which was the peak year for Chinese investment so far, is a lot of private Chinese entities buying property overseas, buying U.S. hotels, places to store money overseas that if you got a lot of money, you don't want to buy a house, you want to buy a hotel. Now the Chinese have cracked down on that. So we had a short period of time, 2015, 2016, where that private investment in tourism and entertainment and commercial office buildings was equal in importance and in size to that strategic investment from the state. The private investors have been shut down largely, not entirely, but largely. The strategic investment is continuing.
Interesting. Well, how does that wrap into then, and we're talking about outbound investment, how does that wrap into the One Belt, One Road initiative? I mean, where do you see that leading to as far as the Chinese interests are?
Well, so One Belt, let me just give you a little background because I think it's useful for people to realize. When Xi Jinping announces One Belt, One Road in 2013, China's foreign exchange reserves are soaring. They've been soaring for basically 20 years. And so it's kind of impossible for anyone, including me, I would have gotten this wrong too, to imagine that the Chinese would actually not have enough money. But 6 months after he makes the announcement, Chinese reserves start falling. They fell $1.3 trillion in a 3-year period. They're still the largest in the world, and now they're stable, but the Chinese are no longer in a period of we just spend whatever money we want and reserves always rise. So the initial Belt and Road was this very grand endeavor. It's not going to be nearly as grand as the initial conception was because their financial situation has changed in a very surprising and sharp fashion. What you have with Belt and Road now, and I use this all the time, from 2014 to 2016, that 3-year period, if you took all the original 64 Belt and Road countries combined, there was less investment in those countries than there was in the United States alone. So Belt and Road is not an investment program. It's not buying assets and owning them. What it is a construction program. The Chinese will expand your port. They'll build you a new airport. They'll build you a highway. They'll build you a power plant. And they'll do it pretty well. They have good engineering companies, and they'll do it for much less money because it'll be subsidized than the commercial bids that you get. So that's what's mostly going on in Belt and Road countries. There's a lot of construction. There was construction there before, but it's accelerated with Belt and Road. And so when we think about, what's going on here in the United States, well, the Chinese are going to invest in the United States as much as they can, as much as we let them. Has nothing to do with Belt and Road. What Belt and Road has done is it's told Chinese construction companies, and there are some very big Chinese construction companies, you're going to get financing to go out and, change infrastructure, especially in 64 or as Belt and Road expands more countries. That's what's really going on there. It's a giant construction project.
Wow, that's it's like road construction around Chicago. It's going to be permanent employment, right?
Well, right. It's right. I mean, it'll never stop. You'll have maintenance and so on. It's obviously a tool of foreign aid, but the first thing is it's state construction engineering. It's China National Machinery. It's China Communications Construction. It's State Grid going into these countries and saying, we're going to build something for you that's almost as good as what anyone else can build and a lot cheaper. Are you interested?
I'm raising my hand. Hey, in this vein, right, you talk about Chinese investment to some extent, but you recently wrote an article on CFIUS and Chinese investment and how to improve both. And just for the audience, CFIUS is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. on how to improve both of these, maybe you could just start off, I want to talk about this, but maybe you could just start off, what's the role of CFIUS for our audience?
So CFIUS is supposed to review incoming foreign investment to make sure it doesn't harm national security. Someone is building a wind power site. This is an example from the real world near a U.S. naval base. Right. Build your wind power site someplace else. Yep.
Right, and this is part of the U.S. Treasury Department, right?
Well, it's run by Treasury. It has input from a number of government agencies, including the Department of Defense, but it is housed and run by Treasury. It's not entirely a Treasury operation.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt you. Go ahead.
Right, that's right. So Treasury, obviously, because there's a financial aspect, and other agencies because there can be a national security aspect. And our policy until, let's say, the middle of 2015, or maybe a little earlier, certainly through the end of 2014, was 99% of transactions are fine. We're not worried about this. When we were in deep competition with the Soviet Union, they didn't have any money to buy American technology. Iran doesn't have that kind of money. North Korea doesn't have any money. So we've had a CFIUS that has been present, not very visible, and really didn't matter to the investment process in more than 99% of cases. And what's changed is the Chinese want technology, and they do have the money. And starting in 2015 especially, we've just seen a surge in Chinese attempted investments that could have a national security component. And so CFIUS has become much more newsworthy. It's become the focus of congressional attention. There's multiple congressional bills pending now to reform CFIUS, and it's a response to Chinese attempts to acquire technology first and foremost. There's some other things going on there, but that's at least 51% of it. It's China and tech, and whether we should change our rules to say we still want foreign investment, but you guys, the Chinese, you cannot buy into our biotech sector, you cannot buy into our chip sector, and so on.
Right. So what are your top 5 recommendations then for the reform?
Well, the number one thing that I think we have consensus on, which is really important, which is that Congress and the administration are both asking CFIUS to do more because the Chinese are putting more pressure on the organization. We have to staff them appropriately. You have to provide them with the resources to hire people who can read Chinese, who can do the research, who are informed in both the financial or informed in the financial or the national security aspects of the work. So CFIUS needs to be resourced appropriately, which it has not been because, as I said a few years ago, it didn't need more resources. Now it does. That's recommendation number one. My recommendation, and everybody's on board with that, although, with Congress, we'll see when they get down to brass tacks what in the way of resources they're really willing to give CFIUS. But my recommendation number 2, which is not that popular, is to be honest about what we're talking about here, which is we're not talking about Britain. We're not talking about New Zealand. We're not talking about Rwanda. We're talking about China. And, we should be saying we have a special concern for Chinese investment in certain sectors. The sector should be identified by the national security community and updated. So I want a very explicit country focus and a very explicit sector focus. And CFIUS hasn't worked that way. CFIUS has been about vagueness and flexibility, and we know what we don't like when we see it, and we'll get around to telling you, but we won't tell you why. And that's worked fine because there's been just a couple of cases a year that were really an issue. That's just not true anymore. So what I want is for CFIUS to be much more explicit about we're targeting Chinese firms in these sectors. If China changes its behavior, or if some other countries of concern change their behavior, fine, we'll reevaluate. We'll reevaluate the sectors to find out what's really important to national security. Another principle, which is not about changing CFIUS, it's about protecting CFIUS, is CFIUS should be about national security only. There's a bill in the Senate, bipartisan, that wants to intervene in the foreign investment process on economic grounds, and to say that foreign investment might not be good for the United States, and we have to decide, and it has no criteria attached to it. It's basically a power grab by the U.S. by the federal government. If this were to go through, I don't think it will, but it would basically be a power grab by the U.S. government to interfere in the foreign investment process on just very, very vague economic criteria. And that's just a terrible idea. Arguing about how CFIUS should protect national security, you can have legitimate arguments about that. Saying we need to get in the way of foreign investment because I want the jurisdiction for these decisions in my committee or in my bureau in the administration, that's really needs to be fought off. And so far, at least, that bill doesn't seem to have much of a chance of passage.
Well, I guess it's stating the obvious, but the U.S.-China economic relationship is complicated. trade. And both countries export and import a tremendous amount of goods and services from each other. And this has generated, obviously, a lot of concerns over the future of U.S.-China trade relations. Break this down for our audience. Where do you see this heading in 2018?
I think we're headed for a sharper trade dispute. You and I are talking in 10, 15 minutes in advance of the president's somewhat teased announcement on trade. I don't know what that is. It might get folded into North Korea or other things. But whether there's a big announcement today or whether it's in January or whether it's later in the year, we know we're coming up to going to be a hotly contested congressional election. We know President Trump has talked about bilateral trade deficits as being harmful for the United States. I don't entirely agree, but that's what he said. And we're seeing the bilateral trade deficit we have with China rise. And I think next year it's going to be very difficult for the president when he comes under criticism from Democrats, from protectionist groups, from labor groups, who said, you promised during the election that you were going to do something about China, and you haven't. So I think we're headed, if that's the case, I think we're headed towards the administration wanting to take really unprecedented U.S. action towards China. That's kind of not saying very much because we haven't done very much on the economic side to check Chinese behavior. But I think we're going to get something beyond anything the U.S. has done before. The obvious vehicle for this is something called a Section 301 investigation, which is the U.S. determining if a country or a set of firms actually is engaging in acts harmful to American national interests. It's aimed at China. It's aimed at coercive technology transfer and cyber theft, a long-standing problem the U.S. has never done anything about. And that's a way for the United States to say, all right, finally, we're doing something about this, and then the door's open. And I do not know what we're planning to do. Consulting with the administration about facts in the investigation, not involved in the policy decision-making process. But if I'm right that the U.S. has to act against China, we have a way. It's on the table, and we're expecting some result out of it, maybe in 10 minutes, but probably more likely in January.
Okay, fair enough. And I'm sorry we got this 10 minutes before that announcement, but I think you're prescient enough to give us some insight into it. But before I let you go, Derek, what are your top 3 things for 2018 you're keeping an eye on? Obviously, what you just laid out is a really important one. I would say that maybe that's one of your top 3. What else do you got?
I think very connected to that, although maybe people don't immediately see it, is, and it's not a China topic, but it's very important for U.S.-China economic relations, is what happens with the NAFTA negotiations. That's what's absorbing USTR's, United States Trade Representative's attention right now. If the president doesn't act on NAFTA and on Mexico, which is obviously an irritant, and again, I'm not advocating that he do so. I'm saying if he doesn't, as a matter of political reality, there's only one other country he can show toughness on. It's China. Nobody cares if we sanction Belgium. It doesn't matter if you find some country, a little tiny country that's really a bad trade partner. It doesn't matter. There are only 2 countries that really matter in terms of U.S. trade right now, and that's China and Mexico. So NAFTA needs to be resolved to see what the position of the administration is, and oddly enough, the more protectionist the administration is on NAFTA, the more flexibility they have not to act on China. The more open-minded they are about NAFTA, the less flexibility they have to act on China. So the thing I said about U.S. action against China, the main way I see that not happening is if we act against Mexico instead. And this comes back to the president saying he's going to be different on trade than previous U.S. presidents. I take him at his word. I think he believes that, and I think we'll see that in 2018. So the China-Mexico decision, I think, is the main event. The other interesting thing that's going to happen, well, maybe it's only interesting to nerds, but if we go through with tax reform, and if it's a big tax cut, as the president has promised and many members of Congress have promised, that's going to stimulate U.S. consumption, which means the trade deficit's going to rise. So what people aren't thinking about with regard to tax reform is the president is saying it's a big tax cut. Well, if it's a big tax cut, and you and I and everybody listening has more money in their pockets, some of that money is going to get spent on imports. Meanwhile, other countries aren't doing that, so why are they going to buy more in the way of American exports? that means a larger trade deficit. And how that's going to play out politically in the 2018 election, during 2019 with the administration and whoever's in charge of Congress. We don't normally think of tax reform as having trade relevance, but the president's emphasis on bilateral deficits means that this tax reform has a lot of relevance to trade.
Okay, AEI's Derek Scissors, thanks for coming on the show today. This has been illuminating. I love having you on. Thanks again.
I really enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.
What's nice about having Derek on the show is that he brings a different perspective to what's happening in China and the US from what you read in the mainstream financial press. And that helps me gain a wider viewpoint on what's happening in the region. Pretty cool. Hey, let's finish up with what made me stop and think this week. Again, check out the disclaimer at the end of the show to know we're not promoting or endorsing anyone here. But this week, I found a data release and a map of the worldwide croplands from the USGS, or U.S. Geological Survey. You can find them at usgs.gov. It's entitled, oddly enough, A New Map of Worldwide Croplands Supports Food and Water Security. But the visuals are pretty cool, and you can see anywhere in the world who's growing on what land. What the project also shows is that there's 15 to 20% more hectares of cropland than previously thought. I would have liked to have seen acres or something that I could understand, but okay, there you go. The point is that it is a lot more land that crops are being grown on, and I think that's the key takeaway here. India has the most in the entire world, comprised of 9.6% of the total, with the U.S. second at 8.9% and China at 8.8%. I'm going to spend some time playing around with the maps and the data, but the thought that jumps into my mind right away is I wonder if this 15 to 20% more cropland is one of the contributing factors to the increasing global food production and the decrease in global food costs and ag prices. And that is something to think about. All right, that's a wrap for me. Remember, if you want to hear more podcasts, you can go to our website, cftc.gov, and click on the podcast button. Or you can find us on iTunes by searching for CFTC Talks on your podcast app. We'll be back next week with another guest on our quest to learn about the markets we watch. I'm Andy Bush. Thanks for listening. But wait, we're not done yet. It's time for a disclaimer. The CFTC is providing this information as a public service, and it is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or any third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in this podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provide similar services to those of the guests. The views and opinions expressed by the guests in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated or referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing its interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting possible outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult an attorney.